set up, how you travel to work?
By public transport, on the underground when functioning, and stay at home when it's on strike.
How did you first become involved in the British Union of Fascists?
I was on a holiday from South Wales to London, and I came across a black shirt meeting on a street corner in Kilburn. And there was a black shirt speaker trying to make himself heard above a howling mob, and I very naively asked the loudest interrupter why he didn't keep quiet and listen to the meeting. And he said, "We haven't come to listen, we've come to smash it." And I thought that was very odd, and took an immediate interest and started subscribing to their publications when I got back home to South Wales.
And when was this?
The first meeting would have been about 1934, and I actually joined in March 1935.
So did you wear the black shirt yourself?
No, you had to be an active member, given at least 5 nights service to wear the black shirt, and I was very restricted through, in that period, teaching in private schools, so I couldn't be an active member in that sense. My activities were more writing under non-proclaimed local newspapers and that sort of thing.
What was the attraction to you at that time of this intensely nationalistic, patriotic movement?
Yes, I saw it in those terms, looking at it through very British and nationalistic eyes, and what I thought was most in the interests of the British people, and what was not in their interest, which appeared to be, at that time, entanglement in European affairs. We had... there was the expression the haves and have-nots. Well, Britain was certainly a have power in the sense that its empire covered a quarter of the Earth's surface and 1/5 of the world's total population, and every foodstuff and raw material you could possibly imagine. It was a have-not power in the sense that, according to Lord Boyd, we had 19 million people undernourished and 3 million unemployed through, we would argue, the mismanagement of affairs by successive British governments.
It's difficult to understand this half a century after the Second World War, the personal magnetism of Oswald Mosley. When you first came across him, what struck you about him?
I would answer the question by saying, first of all, I've said in my autobiography, actually replay, I was very pleased that I joined the movement before I ever saw him or heard him speak. We used to be rather patronising about what we called Albert Hall fascists, people who went along to these great meetings in the short period when Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail was backing him, and the devs of the period would go along with Union Jacks round their bare shoulders and so on, and join on the spur of the moment, and then be horrified when they found that Mosley was advocating not right-wing Toryism, but National Socialism, and that they would leave again in droves. So I joined purely through reading the literature, and eventually heard Mosley speak, and went up and shook hands with. We used to joke, I didn't wash my hands for a week afterwards. Was tremendously impressed by the oratory and the magnetism and so on then, but that was not what attracted me in the first place.
Can you describe what he looked like?
In physical appearance, tall, dark and handsome. Who was it who said he was too good to be true? He had everything, and physical appearance, first-class mind, wonderful powers about oratory. Everything about him would attract a personal following.
The question arises then, why did this tremendously able politician, this person with a very good intellect, a very good speaker, turn in the mid-1930s, 1935-36, to what's sometimes described as rabble-rousing anti-Semitism?
Well, I would certainly deny the latter part of that question. His reasons, he has been criticised by friendly critics for leaving the old parties, and it's been pretty generally acknowledged that reviews of his autobiography, My Life, said the only man who could have been either a Labour or Conservative Prime Minister. And was it an error for him to turn his back on all that? We would argue no, that he found it absolutely impossible to achieve things in either party. In the Labour Party, the rejection of the Mosley Memorandum Freedom, and later published as the Mosley Manifesto, and a so-called socialist Chancellor, Snowden, dismissing it as wildcat finance. The city will never stand for it. And convinced us that the Labour Party, like the Conservative Party, had completely sold out. And the original idea, which got off the ground for a short period, was to have a new party which would attract the best from expressions we never use, left and right. I don't know what they mean. I know what they mean on the football field. I honestly don't know what they mean in politics. But attracting from the so-called left and so-called right into a centre position. And the new party failed disastrously in the 1931 election, and Mosley then took the very controversial step of saying we don't need just a new party, but something entirely above parties, a movement, and a fascist movement. And fascism was not a discredited word then, as it became later. It just became a term of abuse. On the anti-Semitism, we have always denied the allegation and claimed that we did not attack Jews for being Jews any more than we attacked other people because of their race. We attacked certain Jews and many non-Jews for what they said or did, and that is not anti-Semitism. I say again in my autobiography, it's been discussed and argued many times, one man who had no doubt about it was the Arne Lies who formed the Imperial Fascist League and always called us kosher fascists, with this extraordinary allegation that Mosley was paid by the Jews to run a phony fascist movement to take people away from the pure and unadulterated version of Arne Lies.
When did you start working closely with Mosley as his assistant and personal secretary?
After the war. Between the end of the war and the formation of the post-war movement in February 1948, I was running an ex-service organisation, the British League of Ex-Service Men and Women, and two Mosley book clubs, which we set up to distribute his literature when it was being boycotted by the trade. And he sent for me, I made no approach to him, and asked me would I come and do some nominal work in the office. Actually, it was the bookkeeping, and it would leave me free to speak, because my forte was regarded as speak. I never thought of myself as a writer, though I have 2 books out now. And I spoke lunchtime meetings, 3 times on a Sunday morning in East London, dash off Sunday afternoon to Clapham Common, and back to East London or North London in the evening. And that's how it all came about.
Going back to the late 30s, when war was imminent, as soon as war was declared, as I understand it, Sir Oswald Mosley told his followers, you must support the war effort. Your country needs you in time of war. So at one stage he was saying we shouldn't declare war, but he was telling his followers, do your bit in the armed services. Is that right?
With respect, I don't think you've got the wording quite right there. He didn't say, he said we should do nothing to injure Britain or assist an enemy. We should obey the law, and particularly if we were members of the forces, we had a number of members in the forces, we should obey the rules of the forces. But subject to that we should do everything within the law to try to persuade the government to make a just and honourable peace. And we claim, of course, to follow in very respectable footsteps. Charles James Fox, Cobden and others who opposed the Napoleonic Wars. Lloyd George in his opposition to the Boer War and the tremendous Birmingham Town Hall meeting and the riot there. Nearly all the original Labour leaders in opposition to the 1914 war. And it was never suggested, they got a certain amount of abuse and so on, but never really suggested that they were traitors or enemy agents. You should be certainly as free to express your views on peace and war, the most important thing in anybody's life, as you should on housing or economics or any other position.
Yet it has to be said that during the Second World War Hitler was our enemy, and Sir Oswald Mosley did have quite close personal links with Hitler, and his wife even closer links.
Well, we wouldn't think they were so close. He had met him twice, I think, and Mussolini once or twice. He had met Roosevelt, not only in political terms, but had spent a fishing holiday with him. So did that make him pro-American? It was his duty to meet leading statesmen anywhere in the world. He went to India and did an extensive tour there. So we would strenuously deny the allegation that he was pro-Hitler in that sense, or pro-German in that sense. We opposed the war not because we were pro-German, certainly in that sense of the word, but because we were pro-British and did not think it was in British interests.
And then Sir Oswald Mosley, Lady Mosley, and many of his supporters were interned during the war under the 18B regulations. Were you among those who were interned?
The first arrests were in May 1940, and I heard of them relevant to this program, but possibly on the World Service of the BBC, because I was a travelling teacher in the Falkland Islands at that time. Heard of these arrests, thought, I suppose they will arrest every member, and I shall be picked up soon. Then as days went by, I thought it was quite absurd that they would bother about someone in a little island 8,000 miles from Britain. And it was a tremendous surprise to me to be suddenly arrested one morning, the 3rd of June 1940, in San Carlos, in the Falkland Islands, and I was detained there for a while and then shipped off illegally, it appears later, from my Home Office file in the Public Record Office to South Africa, and was eventually released and came home and did something controversial. Some of my friends don't agree. Volunteered for the forces on the old-fashioned principle, my country right or wrong, totally opposed to the war, thinking our political opposition to it was right, but that as we were at war, and there was a danger of invasion at that time, it was I don't want to sound priggish, but my patriotic duty to serve. And I volunteered and served in the Royal Tank Regiment.
Where were you held in the Falklands? Where were you held in prison?
In very, very bad conditions indeed. I was arrested on the far end of the East Falkland. Took us several days on horseback to Riyadh, and the last lap, I have a peculiar sense of humour that sees the absurdity of unpleasant situations. They appeared to arrest me, sent out 3 members of the local defence force, enormous fellows towering over me, with handcuffs and revolvers, and asked me, was I going to come quietly, what I was supposed to do. In a very short time they discovered all that was quite superfluous, and we had a most friendly relationship. And on the last stretch, the absurdity was we were having a race, and my guards had rather better horses than I did, and I was flogging my poor old horse to try to catch up with my jailers. Had a very bad fall, arrived in Port Stanley with face covered in blood, and a wild rumour spread that I had resisted arrest and been overcome, and I was put on the wreck of a ship in the harbour of Port Stanley. Very, very bad conditions indeed, down in the hold of this rat-infested hulk with rats running around and chasing the ship's cat, and was detained there most of the time, taken ashore a short period before I left, and then transferred to, not told where I was going, just put on a ship, and I landed in South Africa and was taken up to an internment camp in the Transvaal.
Was there an active fascist movement in the Falklands?
Nothing at all. Great respect to them. They knew nothing of the outside world at all. Education was restricted to this travelling teacher who would ride back and forth across the island and stay 1 week for one child, 2 weeks for more than one child. So a poor child at the end of the island, San Carlos, would have a week or a fortnight's tuition about once every 6 months, and they knew nothing about politics at all. So I certainly it wasn't suspected that I was doing anything really subversive there. So nobody, the local people didn't know. It came back to me on the grapevine later that a dear old lady was asked, well, why was I interned? And she said, he tried to sell the Falkland Islands, but I've never discovered to whom and for how much, and who on earth would want to buy the Falkland Islands.
So it must have come as a tremendous shock to your pupils and their parents when you were arrested in this rather dramatic manner.
It did to them. It certainly was to me. I've said to people, I've asked friends sometimes who have ever had the experience of hearing something so incredible that you don't think you've heard correctly. And when they said to me, we have a warrant, when I saw them ride in towards the house, I took no notice, because you had an open house in the Falklands. You even left your door open when you went out for the day, so that people could go in and take food, because they could die of exposure if they didn't. So I took no notice of them coming in, and couldn't believe my ears when they said, we have a warrant for your arrest. But I took it quite philosophically, and the only time I broke down at all, if you like, was when a woman in whose house I stayed previously said something like, poor Mr. Hamm, and showed great sympathy. But otherwise I was quite philosophical about it.
After the war, when you were active in the British Union, the Union movement as it became, and you were working very closely with Sir Oswald, what sort of man was he to work with?
When I came to write the autobiography, I was quite clear in my mind that I would never write anything hostile to him at all. But I thought if I didn't make some mild criticisms, the book would be unbalanced and I would be regarded as just hero worshipping and so on. So I made some very mild criticisms. I deal with the allegation, a common allegation against him, that he was very arrogant. I would say no. He was supremely self-confident and therefore irritated. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and irritated by anyone who was interfering with what his biographer Robert Skidelsky called the vision splendid. He was a hard taskmaster. He would, after a very strenuous day, would get home and get to bed, and the telephone would go about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and he would say, I hope I'm not disturbing you, and would take it quite in order to give me some involved message there, which I couldn't possibly do in the middle of the night. And little things like that. And I met him once off a train in Manchester, and he stepped into the first taxi that he saw, and a railway policeman said to him, you can't do that, sir, there's a long queue. And he said, queue? Too much of that damn nonsense in this country, and had driven off before the policeman could think of any answer to it. So if you resented that way, you would regard him as a very hard taskmaster. But if you enjoyed it all, as I did, I throve on it. I thought he was a tremendous character, and I'm very grateful to having had the experience of being closely associated with him. I've often wondered would I have been a very different person if I hadn't, but there you are.
2 points of criticism I've heard made, not by his followers, but by those not entirely unsympathetic. One is that he was a bit of a part-time politician. It's something he came to and then sometimes would drop away from and return to. And the other is that he was embarrassed by a series of sexual adventures which rather distracted from his politics. And would you have any comment on that?
Well, on the first one, I would say no. Before the war, he was very strict about, he mustn't be seen in expensive restaurants and that sort of thing. After the war, he regarded that as rather absurd, and lived a much more normal life. On his personal relationships, we were very saddened and angered by his son's book about him. Our own attitude was perfectly clear. We had a rigid rule never to interfere in any way in people's private lives. The only proviso was, I'm sure it answers your question, your private life must never interfere with your task, whatever it is, whatever your job may be, and certainly in our politics. I put it this way in my own book. When I was organising meetings, if someone had appeared upon the platform drunk, he never did, it would be my job to have got him off very quickly. Once the meeting was over and the man went home, it was no business of mine then whether he drank a bottle of whiskey before going to bed, or whether he went to bed with his wife, or the wife of the man next door, or some other man. And that was Mosley's attitude, and I would never think that his private life interfered in any way with his politics.
But it was still quite an adventurous private life.
I only know from hearsay and from reading his son's book. I never encountered it, and Lady Mosley was certainly devoted to him up to the time of his death, and will do anything to preserve his memory since.
His final years in politics were perhaps rather sad. He appeared to be a politician in waiting for the call, as de Gaulle was at one point, yes. And of course the call never came. Do you think he died a disappointed man?
I'm sure the answer is no. Lady Mosley has given the same answer many times. Relevant, this is not going off the tangent, relevant to your question, he had a great sense of humour. And over this waiting for the call, I showed him once a cartoon in Punch, and there were two sort of foreign office types, and one had a telephone in his hand with a hand over the receiver, and was saying, "It's Mosley asking if the British public are asking for him yet," and he roared with laughter at it. He used to say, up until a year or so before his death, his faculties began to fail a bit, but at 80 he was at the height of his mental powers, and certainly for about 2 years after, and used to say perfectly objectively, if I was required in any way, if I could serve my country in any way, I would do so. The call never came. I don't think it disappointed him. My own attitude would be it wasn't a tragedy for him, it was a tragedy for Britain. We might be in a much better position now if his policies had been adopted.
You keep his ideas alive, but they don't really appeal to more than a very, very small coterie. There's not really a wide audience for those ideas at the moment. Do you feel disappointed by that?
No, there isn't a wide audience in the sense that we, with our limited financial resources, we cannot reach a wide audience. We publish a little monthly Action and a quarterly magazine, Lodestar, and sell books by and about him, including my own. And it's very difficult to reach a mass market with publications of that kind. But I would think that there's tremendous potential support, and many people are saying privately what we say as publicly as we can. So I don't feel disappointed. I have no illusions of grandeur, and I don't think I'm saving the world or anything like that. But as long as I retain my faculties, I would want to go on saying what I could. And it might be a voice crying in the wilderness or a drop in the ocean, but I would think it's better than sitting back and doing nothing.
Can I just ask you about the sort of Britain that Mosley envisaged? Now, it'd be what would often be called a corporate state, and there'd be no functioning parliamentary democracy. Is that right?
That is true, but we would argue that that was true democracy. We could raise a number of criticisms of the present parliamentary system, that it does not really serve the people. We could produce a long list of broken election promises in the last century, for instance. And another criticism would be, I'm very much a product of South Wales, of a mining area. Tremendous respect for my neighbours who worked in the mines. But how could they possibly understand complex questions of inflation, of deflation, of devaluation of the currency, and so on? They would have been experts on mining. So they would have voted as miners for a mining corporation. And the great industries would have had corporations of the employers, the employees, and the chief consumers who would mutually agree on wages and prices, with the central government interfering only in rare occasions when it was felt the agreement was not in the national interest. So that was a brief outline of the corporate state idea, and which I would certainly claim to have been true democracy. After the war, we felt it was a little too complicated, and we toyed with the idea of syndicalism, which wasn't very popular. The average factory worker is not really interested in who owns the industry, as long as he gets good conditions and wages which are policies could have produced. We were very critical of nationalisation, which when it was first propounded, Mosley described as the buying up of obsolete industries at public expense. And I think we've been proved right on that. If the railways are nationalised, why are the workers going on strike against themselves, or why were the strikes in the mines? So we take a broader view now that the details of government or the running of industry don't really matter. It is the overall policy on wages and prices.
If the BUF had been a bit bigger in the 1930s, how would Mosley have sought to take power? Through the ballot box, or since he didn't really believe in parliamentary democracy, would he have tried some putsch, some coup d'etat?
No, I'm quite sure he would never have tried anything. Although we didn't believe in the parliamentary system, we would not have obtained votes by false pretences. We would have told people in advance, if you vote for us, we are going to radically change the system. So it was perfectly legitimate, having said that, to have sought power through the ballot box.
So he wasn't in that sense a revolutionary?
That's very politicians usually start off by saying that's a good question, but it certainly is. Yes, a revolutionary, because we propose radical changes, but a revolution does not have to be won by through bloodshed. I wrote a very piece recently that when I used to hear communists, for instance, using the word revolution, I used to tease them on the platform by saying I never knew whether the noun was derived from the verb to revolt or to revolve, because they appeared to be going round in ever-diminishing circles, and you wondered whether they were going to end up. So yes, I would say we were and still are revolutionaries, but seeking revolutionary changes through the ballot box, which is the only way you can in this country. Mosley used to say Britain is not a South American banana republic, and always rather ridiculed. The talk, as there was some years ago in certain MI5 circles and army circles, of taking over by force, which is absolutely ridiculous, apart from being immoral and so on.
Looking back, if I may ask just one final question, do you think that the adoption of the military-style black shirt uniform was a mistake because it made the BUF look too sinister, too paramilitary?
By hindsight it may have been, but hindsight is always a dangerous way of approaching any question. The basic purpose of the black shirt was to distinguish friends from foes at the very rough meetings. There's enormous evidence that opposition to us was highly organised. The classic one always quoted is the Olympia meeting, and was certainly desirable to have stewards clearly identified. After when the uniform was banned, they had armbands or something like that. Not only the wearing of the uniform, but the ejection of interrupters at meetings is a dilemma. It was public meetings were our only means of propaganda. There was no television. Just be coming in. He was almost completely barred from radio, so the public meetings were essential. If they were going to be broken up, if you just allowed them to be broken up, then you were completely silenced. The dilemma was that if you exercised your right under the law to eject interrupters after giving them a warning, you were portrayed by the press as a gang of brutal thugs. Olympia was the classic one, and after it a pamphlet was published denouncing our stewards and saying how rough they were, and we published a counter pamphlet called Red Violence and Blue Lies, because should be to their eternal shame, the right-wing, if I may use that expression, right-wing Tory press backed the communists who had gone in with knuckle dusters, axes, stockings full of broken glass, and so on. A specific one we like to quote was Philip Toynbee. who told and repeated many times in later years, or been set, as soon as he opened his mouth in protest, he was set upon by brutal thugs and thrown down the stairs. Forgotten that in his early autobiography, Friends Apart, he had written about buying knuckle dusters on the day of Olympia and marching along with other communists chanting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we want Mosley dead or alive. And finished the paragraph. 3 hours later we were outside on the pavement, bruised, battered and tearful. Poor little darling, he got the finest hiding of his life, and it left his mark upon him for life. But that is the sort of thing I would justify up to the hilt, and take the advice which Lloyd George gave Mosley the first time they met, and Mosley passed on to me years later. Never apologise, say it again and be rude at the second time.